Okay, so today I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Bax, who's here at JALTCALL 2012 in Nishinomiya in Japan, and he gave a keynote speech yesterday, which I'd like to talk about later on, if we can. But first of all, you work at Krella, at the University of Bedfordshire. Could you tell us a little bit about your work there? And
yes, I've been there 3 years now, and the Krella is a research centre. The name is the Centre for Research in English Language Learning and Assessment, and it's run by Professor Cyril Weir, and mainly it works in assessment areas for English language, but it also, obviously works in other areas of methodology and other aspects of English language education. And we're a small team, about 7 or 8 staff, full-time and part-time, but highly specialist, and we cover in particular all the areas of language assessment, speaking, listening, reading, writing, and so on. We do a lot of work overseas.
Okay. And I was reading a couple of things that you've been working on recently, and I was interested in the eye tracking technology to look at how people read.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, in the last 2 years we've done some work with using eye tracking to follow readers undertaking reading tests, on-screen reading tests. So, for example, the reader sits down and starts to do the test, reading the text and the questions, and we track the eye movements as they go through the process. And this helps us to understand, or the aim is to help us to understand more about the cognitive processes that they go through. Obviously, linking the eye tracking data with interview data and other retrospective discussions of what they were doing. And the idea is to try to understand the process of reading better while people are doing reading tests. And we think that's quite an innovatory approach. I think we're the first people who've used eye tracking for analysing reading tests. We've published one thing on that so far, and we're hoping for more later. But we do find it a very interesting insight into people's thinking as they read. And one of my interests is reading. My PhD was based on reading. So it's one of the areas that we're really keen to work with. Particularly, of course, the link of that with language testing. And exam boards around the world, for example, are really keen to know what readers are doing, particularly comparing good readers with weaker readers. That's obviously a great interest of teachers as well.
Are you finding, is there anything that you found that was surprising?
Well, in a very broad way, we found that good readers, the ones who tend to get more of the answers right in tests, tend to be far more strategic than less good readers, but they all have different kinds of strategies depending on their own personal taste or their educational background and so on. But you can see almost immediately, as soon as they start, that good readers have particular strategies that they follow through quite determinedly, whereas weak readers tend to look here and there, they don't have any particular idea of what they want to do. So there is this evidence is coming out a little bit, but we need to substantiate that more, research it a bit more carefully and publish something on it. But that's quite an interesting finding that we're having. But beyond that, I think it is important to note that good readers seem to have quite different eye movement strategies. For example, some will determinedly read the whole of the text first before even looking at the questions. Others will read all the questions first before looking at the text. And they can still, both of them, get very good marks on it. There's not one best way in that respect. But it does seem to be that the ones who are strategically determined are the ones who seem to come out better in the end.
That's interesting, thank you. And the other thing that you've been working on as well, you published a book quite recently, last year, year before?
The end of 2010.
About discourse and genre.
Yes. Well, again, discourse and genre links with my PhD research, which was on intertextuality and reading. And I'm fascinated by reading, but also by extension listening as well, and basically the ways in which people understand texts. And that's where the interest in genre and discourse comes from. So the idea, if you see a text, for example, a poster on a wall, you can very quickly, if you're familiar with posters, you can very quickly look at it, recognise the genre, identify what the key function of the text is, and so on. And the book's really exploring all different kinds of discourse and how we understand discourse.
Okay, thank you.
It's not specifically for language teaching, but obviously it has a relevance to language teachers because of the huge discourse element in the profession. But it does have elements of looking at classroom discourse, for example.
Can I take you back now to when you got started in teaching?
Sure.
What's your
That's
kind of
ancient
journey?
history. Yes. When I left university, I saw all my friends going to work for things like the gas board and the civil service, and that didn't inspire me at all. So I saw a small newspaper advertisement in the Guardian newspaper in London, which said, teachers wanted for Sudan, no experience necessary. But they wanted a degree, which I had, a degree in English, and therefore I went to Sudan and really loved it. I had a wonderful time there. I was 2 years there in a small village on the Nile in the north of Sudan, in a place called Argo, near Dongola. And was teaching in a girls' school, secondary school, and had a wonderful experience and learned Arabic while I was there, and enjoyed the language teaching side of it too. And then it went from there.
Where else have you taught?
I then went to Algeria for a year. After that, I did my PGC in TESOL in Bangor, North Wales, with Sidney Whittaker, who was the tutor at that time. Had a very enjoyable year there. And then went to Baghdad in Iraq to work for the British Council for 3 years, where I met my wife and married there. She's actually Spanish. We married in Baghdad. And then after that, came back to the UK to do my Masters, and have basically been in the UK ever since, in the university environment, but doing a huge amount of travelling, sometimes too much travelling, around the world to conferences and projects of various kinds.
You were in, was it Thailand last week, did you say?
Vietnam,
sorry.
A few days ago, yes, on the way here to Japan.
To break up the jet lag a little bit.
A little bit, yes.
Well, I guess it's nice to be in demand, right?
Yes, although, I mean, I've worked a huge amount in the Arab world in the early days because of my interest in Arabic and the Arabic culture and so on. But I've started to try, semi-deliberately, to go to other places now, to East Asia, Africa. I'm due to do some work in Ethiopia very soon, which is exciting for me, and Latin America, to use my Spanish a bit more. So I'm almost deliberately trying to see a bit more of the world, and projects of various kinds do come up, which keep me busy.
Okay. Well, it's very nice to have you here, and I guess that leads us on to your keynote from yesterday, and your main focus, and probably the thing I'd say you're best known for. Certainly how I'd heard of you before was about talking about normalisation of technology. Yes. So I suppose, actually, before we talk about normalisation, we should define what technology is, I guess.
That's a tricky one.
Yes, it's a very tricky one, sorry.
Yes, I mean, we had some interesting discussion from the audience yesterday about that issue. How would you define technology? But, I mean, to me, I'd like to adopt a pretty broad definition, which would include such things as a book or a pen or a shoelace or a carpet, even wider than that. I would say anything which effectively facilitates some aspect of human life. It could be a device, or it could even, I mean, we talk about the technology of literacy, Jack Goody and others, who talk about literacy as a technology. Well, literacy is not a physical thing, but nonetheless I think it's fairly accepted that it's a crucial technology and has been in the development of humankind. So for me it's quite a broad definition. It's not simply something electrical that you can plug in. And that's important, because I think if we understand technology in that way, it helps us to think a bit differently about how we use it in our teaching. You start to accept that, for example, a course book is a technology. You could even, if you want to push the limits, say that a teacher is a kind of technology for learning. But some people resent the idea of a human being being a technology. But nonetheless, I think it's important to adopt a broad sense of what technologies are, because that allows you to use different devices and thinkings in your educational work.
Well, I suppose in a very, very simple sense then, normalisation is you could say, the technology which we no longer consider technology has become normalised.
Effectively, normalisation is the stage that you reach when a technology has gone beyond novelty and beyond awkwardness, and is used in such a way that you don't notice it anymore. But it's used productively, and in the language classroom it's used productively for language education. That's where normalisation comes into language teaching. It's not simply used for an extra reason, but it's used for the purpose of learning. And that, I think, as I mentioned in my talk yesterday, the primary element of that is learning, not technology. And I think a key element of the talk yesterday was to emphasise the fact that we have the wow of new technologies, but we have to get beyond the wow very quickly. and focus instead on the learning value of whatever it is we're trying to use. And if you do that, then gradually it may happen the technology becomes normalised in the sense that it goes into the background a little bit, and again the learning comes to the fore, and students actually learn from it. And the technology may not be used all the time, but it has its right place in the classroom at the time when it's most useful.
So some examples of technologies which have become normalised would be things like CDs in an educational context. I mean, whiteboards, pens, blackboards, paper, textbooks, these kinds of things.
And you can see the interesting point that they become normalised, but some of them then disappear off the map. Like in many classes or countries, blackboards are no longer used. Even CDs may no longer be used because we're using other electronic MP3s and so on. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing, that technologies can come and go. And they may be normalised, but then they may disappear when something else comes along. Typically, it's denormalised because something better comes along, which has more applicability or more value.
Yes, I was explaining this concept to some students recently. We were talking about this in the class, and I added an extra stage after normalisation, which was obsolescence. I guess you could say denormalisation, or it becomes weird. Like, I use film cameras a lot, and if somebody sees me bring out a film camera, once it was normalised, now it's very unusual. So I suppose denormalised might be another...
Well, I suppose you could make a distinction. I mean, I've used denormalisation as a term in the past for something where you deliberately try and reduce the use of a particular thing. Like you could argue, for example, in the world now, we should be trying to denormalise the use of the car, so that we don't automatically jump into the car to go to the corner shop, we walk instead. So for me, denormalisation is a more deliberate act, whereas obsolescence is something that can happen almost accidentally. But I think they are related.
So would you say, from educational technologies which have become normalised, do they tend to have some kind of common features or some elements in common which leads to normalisation? And what I'm saying is, do you think we can predict, if we look at technologies we have now, whether they're likely to become normalised or they will not?
I think the answer is no, actually. And the reason for that is that, as I mentioned in my talk yesterday, it's important not to focus on the technology itself in our thinking, because purely the features and elements of a particular technology are not necessarily those which will lead to its normalising or not. What we need to take account of is the social environment in which they're being used, the particular context in which they're being used, because that will often govern whether a technology becomes normalised or not. For a good example is the interactive whiteboard. Now, the interactive whiteboard could be said to be a tremendous technology, technologically speaking. It's got the wow factor in every way. But yet, for various reasons, it hasn't taken off in many cases. And one might be simply cost. That's an economic factor. Another might be the expense and difficulty of replacing the ordinary whiteboard, which is a perfectly good technology and very normalised, with something which doesn't seem on the surface to be particularly innovative or adding anything beyond that. So my prediction for the interactive whiteboard is that probably it will not become normalised much more than it is now, and may become denormalised or obsolescent because other things are coming in so quickly. For example, simply projecting onto a screen with, for example, an iPad, something of that kind, can overtake a lot of what the interactive whiteboard can do. And here in Japan, I'm impressed by the amount of money available for technology in institutions. And people, for example, have racks of iPods which they can take into the class, 40 iPods, or iPads, whole bunches of iPads they can carry into the class.
That's not across the board.
Not across the board, I do understand that, but there are one or two examples of that.
Yes, there are others.
But you can see that this is, if iPads become cheaper, more easily available, which is quite likely, or other tablets are available, of course, then it's quite possible that students in future will each have a device on their desk with which they can communicate to the centre without having to get up to an interactive whiteboard and do something. So in that case, you can see interactive whiteboards have a value, but it could be arguably that they will be replaced by more sedentary pad technology, tablet technology, which has actually been my dream, in a sense, since 2003, when the Normalisation article was written.
I read an article of yours about interactive whiteboards, actually, that you wrote.
That's right, yeah.
It was my understanding that the British Council had used them across all of its centres?
Yes,
and also the state, state education in the UK has
yes.
implemented them, right?
In the UK it has become normalised in
Yeah.
many primary schools, for example, and I've spoken to my kids about it and their experience of it, and they're big admirers of it, and teachers at primary school have a lot of good things to say about it. So in that context, I think they are normalised actually, as we speak. And the British Council, I think, had a policy some years ago where they took out all ordinary whiteboards around the world and put in interactive whiteboards to be cutting edge and so on. And arguably there as well, in some centres, British Council centres worldwide, it has become normalised, but I think not across the board, no pun intended.
It did come across very strongly, you alluded to it there in your talk, that we have to focus on the learner and the learning, not the technology. The technology itself is not the key issue. But one thing I thought was very interesting, you mentioned several times that technology should be seen as a serious tool, and some of the ways in which teachers are using technology kind of devalues it in the minds of the students because we don't treat it seriously.
Well, I think one point that I made is that many young people, I'm thinking of my son who's 14 years old, for example, their main interest in technology is games, is playing, and they love technology for that reason. And if you say to them, we're going to play a game that's going to teach you something, they say, oh, what a lame idea, I want to play it for fun, not for... So in their mind, they associate technology very often with fun outside of school activities. And what I was mentioning yesterday is that the danger, if a teacher simply uses technology in a relatively frivolous wow way, wow, let's just look at this fantastic game, and then leave it and do something different, without connecting and integrating it with the learning experience as a whole, then that reinforces to children the sense that the technology is a frivolous extra. It's not something that has a deep, useful purpose for their actual learning. And so the way that the teacher uses technology in class can actually be a bad model to students in terms of where technology can be in their learning experience. So I think that's another serious reason why teachers should be very careful when they take a technology off the shelf or something they've seen at a conference. They say wow, they go and use it with their students. Their students say wow, but actually the message they're giving to their students is technology is just a frippery and added extra, something on the side. I think it's far more effective for teachers to think a bit more about the value of the technology in the learning, put the learning first, show learners that the technology is really helping in the actual learning, not simply wow, and then that gives the right message to students, which is that technology can play a useful role in their educational process.
It sounds like a lot of work for a teacher, but you certainly fell short of saying we shouldn't bother with it. Because the temptation from some teachers hearing this message will be, well then let's not use it, let's just use the methods that we're happy with. But you don't say that. We're not going to go dogma style. We're not going to throw everything out and...
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, I'm a fan of the Scott Thornbury and the dogma approach of trying to think of doing away with things that we're already familiar, such as course books, and trying the more human interaction. I think there is something to be said for that, and certainly it's a very useful part of the mix. But at the same time, you can say that teachers might also, at other times, use technological devices or technologies or software in a way that is effective, as long as the end point, of course, as Scott would say about dogma, is that learning must be the heart of it all. And so yesterday in my talk I tried to set out some, if you like, some learning principles which we need to bear in mind, which allow for the effective use of technology, but also ensure that the teacher has a clear sense of where the learning aspect is going.
Yes, yeah, that was a very helpful way to finish, actually. And I guess if you could sort of give us a potted version of that would be a nice way to close.
I mean, one reason that I developed that element of the talk was in my annoyance at reading some things by Mark Prensky in the States, where he was basically, I mean, I'm summarising grossly here, but he was basically implying that because younger people are so digitally native and we old folks are digital immigrants, therefore we should just basically give in to the natives and give them whatever they want. And I was thinking that this is not really educationally a very sound approach. So I set out to myself some ideas about what is a key element of the learning process. And these include not only things which technology is really good at, like technology is fantastic nowadays at bringing information into the classroom, bringing pictures, bringing things into the classroom. It's also fantastic at allowing communication of various sorts within the classroom and outside the classroom. It's a wonderful tool for social interaction, social media, of course. But then the teacher can bring things such as, for example, the ability to guide learning, the ability to assess learning, the ability to model good approaches to learning, back to what we said before about the teacher as a good model, and most importantly, the ability to critique and correct and challenge, which seems to me the key thing which Prensky seems to forget, is that is a crucial element in what you could call guided learning. Of course, to some extent, people can learn things on their own, but if we're thinking about education as a guided learning experience, then the guide, typically the teacher, has a role in offering all of these other elements which I think are really crucial and mustn't be forgotten. So that was part of the mix that I was trying to set up, which I think also pleases those who are worried that technology will make us unemployed and will replace us. I certainly don't believe that, and there's no evidence that that's going to happen, I think.
Well, I think that's a very positive message to finish on. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time.